So this is our topic this evening, and it's really an attempt to show how some of the work that all of you have been doing and continue to do can build into a larger purpose, which is a status report on where we are in terms of our planetary ocean. It's an enormous undertaking. I think we're going to be at it for generations, and it's a planetary scale project. But I want to talk to you a little bit about it. As John mentioned, my path toward Ocean Health Index was a little convoluted. My first work when I was in graduate school was on dinoflagellates, looking at bioluminescence and trying to figure out which species were luminescent. And that was really quite wonderful and beautiful work. It did keep me inside of a cold, dark room for months at a time. And so I transferred to looking at copepods and trying to figure out something about what caused luminescence or how luminescence was produced in certain copepods. I couldn't get them to grow in culture, but I could get others to grow. And I noticed that there was a lot of mating activity, so I began to work on pheromone communication in planktonic copepods. And that was really a pleasure, despite more months and years in dark, air-conditioned rooms. And the good thing was I was the only person in the world working on it. And that has a certain pleasure, I have to tell you. The only other person who cared was actually at UCSD at Scripps was Abe Flemminger, whose photomicrographs of copepods showed all of these wonderful sensory receptors. It wasn't clear what they were receiving, and I think that the chemicals that my copepods were putting out is what they were finding. Abe was really, he was the only person in the world really pleased for my results. Anyway, as John said, went to College of the Atlantic and began the whale work. And the real lesson of that work is not that I started or anything like that. It's really about what people can do when working together. And you've seen it with Splash and with other large-scale projects. That's really what it's all about. I had a few little diversions into garden slugs and pheromones and foxes, and then got to the Ocean Health Index. And that's what I want to talk about in a general way tonight. Ben Halpern, who's really the chief scientist of this project, and it simply would never have happened without him, and without a number of other people. Karen McLeod certainly made a huge difference in the history of the project. But Ben sent around this quote from Dan Simberloff. Dan, by the way, happened to be the person who gave me, all those decades ago, my very first culture of copepods, because at that time he was working on it too. Anyway, determining, at least to the satisfaction of all parties, whether an ecosystem is healthy is hopeless. We've seen that different people have different definitions of health, different conceptions of ecosystems, and that even the physical boundaries of an ecosystem are often in doubt. Truly, ecosystem health is not a workable goal, Dan said in 1998. And, I pushed the button. And there's some related issues. Some of you have probably remember the controversial discussion of the metaphor of ocean health and whether, in fact, it could be applied to things larger than one individual. Certainly, health applies to individuals. We know that. It's been increasingly used for populations, a healthy population of stellar sea lions or whatever. And it's also been used to look at healthy cities, healthy economies, and so forth. So people have become more accepting of the broader use of health than simply applicability to an individual. But in any of these cases, when you speak of health, you have to have some specific criteria and some reference points. What is it that you mean by health? And with regard to Dan's critique, early critique, I would say, first of all, there aren't any non-human ecosystems anymore. Our influence on the planet is so pervasive that we really are everywhere, and what's more, our involvement with the ocean is so strong and multifaceted that we are actually ocean people as well as land people. So I feel that the health metaphor controversy is past, and now we can go on to some key questions. And the first is how marine mammals affect ocean health, and the second would be how ocean health affects marine mammals, and then how to define and measure those effects. And for a little bit, I'm going to be enclosing the words ocean health in single quotes because it is a general term right at this moment, and will remain that until we define it in a few minutes. So we all know that health of the ocean, so to speak, affects marine mammals in lots of ways. Pollution of all kinds, organic and inorganic, enriched nutrients, pathogens, both of human source and others, trash in its various forms. We know that fishing, competition from us for food that they need, entanglement with our gear, marine protected areas certainly affect them positively. I think in most cases, direct exploitation has been part of their environment for some wild hunting and culling. Habitat destruction through coastal development, oil mineral exploration we talked about today, and noise, dead zones, all kinds of incursions on habitat. And then, of course, there's the big gorilla, climate change, and its evil twin, ocean acidification. And we don't really know exactly, in all the cases, how that is affecting marine mammals, but the chances are it's not going to be beneficial. And then there's the question of how marine mammals might play into ocean health. Now, 25 years ago now, Hal Whitehead and I wrote a paper together trying to get at this question. We titled it, "Are Cetacea Ecologically Important?" And the kinds of things we looked at were their role in energy flux, their role in food web structure, feeding associations between cetaceans, and seabirds, and dolphins, and so forth and so on. We looked at benthos farming by gray whales, a little bit maybe by right whales, and of course, I think we probably mentioned you might call it farming done by manatees and dugongs as they stimulate growth of seagrass beds through their grazing. We looked at nutrient transfer, at least what was known at that time, both vertical and horizontal. The vertical being sperm whales or other deep diving marine mammals carrying nutrients either down or up if they fed at depth and pooped at the surface. And of course, transferring nutrients horizontally for those species that feed in one place and then migrate and breed in another. We looked at the importance of carcasses in deep sea nutrition, and that's continued to receive some interest, as well as their potential use as stepping stones for distribution of deep sea and possibly event species. And we looked at the animals themselves as carriers of commensals and parasites and the communities that were associated with them, and also mentioned sound cues, because sounds that the animals that you all study make clearly are of interest to lots of other animals in the ocean, both cetaceans and others, as guideposts for navigation and other things. Now, that's all we looked at. We didn't really extend the perspective into the more human-oriented kind of thing, at least not very much. We did not talk about the importance of marine mammals in tourism, which, as you know, is growing every year. We didn't talk about their economic importance in terms of jobs, wages, and revenue derived from tourism. We didn't talk, at least not very much, about cultural values and how cetaceans and other marine mammals are actually involved in culture. We mentioned, I think, subsistence food for Aboriginal cultures, food and fisheries interactions we mentioned a little bit. We did not talk about the commercial interactions with shipping and construction and the minerals industry and so forth. But all of that, if you think about it, now is part of the ecology of these animals and the ecology of the ocean. So if we wrote that paper today and asked if they were ecologically significant, we would have to incorporate, we would want to incorporate all of those things. Now, before there was an Ocean Health Index, and before there was any attempt to really evaluate the importance of marine mammals, or for that matter, the importance of the ocean, marine mammals were doing their good work. And they were acting as symbols and inspirations and playing really important functional roles in increasing system resilience, that is, increasing the actions of people that benefit what we'll come to call ocean health. And you're familiar with a lot of this. Certainly they've been flagship species for a number of NGOs and others and government agencies too, in raising awareness and stimulating action and funding for broader conservation efforts. And certainly the humpback whale has been a foremost animal in this, and the work of Pacific Life in using the humpback whale in its advertising has made an enormous number of friends, not just for the company, but for the ocean. And I appreciate that, and I think we all do too. Certainly, these animals are iconic. That is, they have unique importance for traditional activities, ethnic, religious practices, existence value, or just locally acknowledged aesthetic value. They are featured in lots of different cultures. This being a house front from British Columbia. Some of the iconic species that we are familiar with, dolphins, manatees, killer whales, and so forth. Marine mammals aren't alone, and so I put a panda and tiger up there. There are many others, and they're all doing their good works for conservation. How do you know that something's iconic? People don't usually make lists. Here in the United States, yes, we have license plates, and we have perhaps a bit more evidence than in most places. But it's a layer that is important, but the data really are quite sparse. This is a photograph of the old license plate that NUNUVUT had. It was actually inherited from Northwest Territories, showing a polar bear in outline. And they just issued a new license plate in 2012. They kept the polar bear, they added the northern lights, they added 29 stars representing the NUNUVUT communities, but they kept that animal as something important to their culture. Marine mammals have also functioned as umbrella species, that is, species that have big habitat requirements, which, if given sufficient protection as a reserve area, for example, will somehow be able to protect many other species. And so blue whales, largely, I think, were responsible for the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary, Indian Ocean Whale Sanctuary, and probably a bunch of other whale species will be the stimulus for the South Atlantic Sanctuary and South Pacific Sanctuary if those two materialize. So that's good work. And at least the sea otter's been identified as a keystone species, as you know, whose predation really affects the complexion of the entire intertidal community. And protection of a keystone species does a lot. So in those ways, and also a sentinel species, either, and here I've listed, I don't know if you can see them, but the California sea lion is a sentinel of the interactions between genes and toxins and viruses, urogenital cancers, sea otters as indicators of toxoplasmosis, and so forth and so on, looking through the different species as indicators of harmful algal bloom biotoxins, polybrominate, diphenyl ethers in harbor seals, and so forth. So these animals are already telling us a lot about ocean health, and they have more to tell, I'm sure. So, and the one thing I would add here is that the whales especially did something pretty amazing. They actually led in the transition of public thinking from looking at them as commodities to be taken for oil and bone and so forth back in the whaling days to existence value, save the whales, who knew why, but they needed saving because we didn't want them to go extinct, to yet another transition, which is looking at the social, ecological importance as things that are worth more alive than dead, worth more through the income that they can stimulate through whale watching as well as other things. So that's a pretty marvelous transition in thinking, and they led the way. So the problem with the ocean is that it's big, and bounding it is everything that we do. And advertently or inadvertently, we have lots of effects. So the ocean is changing in ways that are actually unprecedented, and yet there's been no standard way to put all of those things together and make some kind of statement about the health of that vast body of water or portions thereof. So about 5 years ago now, I began at the behest of Greg Stone to try and see whether anybody had made some sort of an index or a study like this, and if not, whether it would be feasible. And luckily, the answer was no, it hadn't really been done, at least as far as I could tell, and it did look as if it might be feasible. So the first idea was, well, why don't we ask the animals? They can tell us if the ocean is healthy because they live there and they integrate everything that happens. And they must be able to tell us in some way, either through their reproductivity or through their condition or something, and it might be different for different organisms. So if we could put together a suite of organisms that represent different trophic levels and so forth and so on, and look at their health as they express it, maybe we could get the answer. So we began that task, and I'm sure I consulted some of you back in those early days about whether this was a good idea, and you were kind enough to say, yeah, that's a pretty good idea, but you might need some other things too. So this would be a suite of animals that we were considering for the California current, and it was the common murre and Cassin's auklet, sooty shearwater, the southern resident killer whale, sea otter, fish, gray whale, and blue whale. And the idea was, well, if we did it right, they would be telling us over time whether this system was functioning well. The problem that we still have not overcome, and I should mention that Peter Stevig is still soldiering away on this idea, is that there are no unequivocal reference points. Unfortunately, the good denizens of the ocean confer about this constantly, and they make different numbers of themselves and each other, but they haven't yet told us which is the right mix. So we're stymied on that one. The next iteration was to try and identify all of the pressures and to set up a metric for reducing them. And this was easy. We humans have been aware of all the pressures for, 50 years, 40 anyway, because you keep seeing them repeated in every treaty and in every global conference. It's the same litany, and yet very little is being done, in my opinion, to actually reduce the pressure. So it made me mad, and I thought, we need to list them all, we need to figure out that metric. The only problem here was that it left out the people. And speakers today in the sound forum downstairs mentioned Ben Halpern's 2008 paper, The Ecological Impacts of People in the Ocean. And what that was doing is cataloging and mapping worldwide the intensity of these pressures. But again, it didn't, as Ben acknowledges, it's only one side of the coin. All of those things were also bringing some benefits to people. Maybe they weren't being done as carefully as they should be, but the benefits and what people need also ought to be part of the equation. And that's where the Ocean Health Index, in its current form, was born through a series of workshops at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at UCSB, and with the consultation of lots and lots of people. And the idea was, let's look at things differently. And it was a method that, in theory, could enable us to say like, which place was healthier, or at least had a higher score, or which context might be healthier. And so you might ask, where did this get us? What is a healthy ocean? And here's what we came up with. And you can get all the details. All you have to remember is Ocean Health Index, put it all together as one word, put it in, and you'll find it. And the website has lots of good stuff. It's not perfect yet. We're still improving it. But the watchword that we came up with was this: a healthy ocean sustainably delivers a range of benefits to people now and in the future. So that's the foundation of this effort. A healthy ocean sustainably delivers a range of benefits to people now and in the future. And it sounds human-centric, and it is. But nature and sustainability are woven throughout this thing. So you'll see, I think, that it is not as upsetting as it might look at first glance. So the first task was to find what it is that people wanted or expected from a healthy ocean. And there were a bunch of things, and most of them could be winnowed down into 10 goals. Food, opportunity to fish for subsistence or recreation in some cases, natural products, ability to market them, carbon storage, coastal protection from storms, tourism and recreation, jobs, wages, revenue, a sense of place, that is something that ocean or that coastal area conveys to you, religiously, spiritually, aesthetically, existence value, even though you've never been there possibly. But that had to be valued. And it had to be done in a way that was kind of tough because nobody really tells you about sense of place. You have to begin to intuit it and find it out from other evidence. Clean waters, of course, was a no-brainer, and biodiversity. So all of this got put together with specific reference points for each goal and sub-goal, specific mathematical models, lots and lots of data layers, and I emphasize, the Ocean Health Index team did not make one single piece of original data. All that data came from researchers like yourselves, from databases that have been assembled, and we just found a model, made a model to put it together. And all the data, because you're dealing with all kinds of layers, some will be in metric tons, and some will be in micrograms, and some will be in dollars, and whatever. They're all normalized from 0 to 1, except for trend, which is -1. And all the data, all the units drop away. The scores go from 0 to 100, and the data are all available at the website. The idea was to have the thing be consistent and transparent and quantitative and work at big scales and small scales, and be able to allow new data or new goals as time changed, and to have indicators that were responsive to management actions, so that if an action were taken, you might be able to see within a reasonable amount of time some change in the goal. And it was based on the best information available at the global level. So there's some advantages and disadvantages in all of this. Number one, it's a portfolio of those 10 goals, including some sub-goals. Sustainability is incorporated throughout the thing in ways that I can show you a little bit about. The idea that benefits to people are central really is utilitarian in two senses. Number one, we're part of the system, and we do make demands upon it. But if the system doesn't help to deliver the benefits that we seek, and it's not just the ocean system, but land also, people are going to do whatever they have to do to survive. And that is not a pretty situation. That's the situation where the last fish gets eaten, or the last man gets killed, or whatever. So people have to have improved well-being for the environment to survive in any reasonable state. And that's why we're focusing on this beneficial relationship between the organisms, the life of the ocean, and the life of our population. there are weights throughout this thing, and you can vary the weights to accommodate different perspectives. But we don't have to worry about that right now. And before we go on, I just want to mention some of the limitations and challenges. The problem is for a global study that the data have to be consistent everywhere from all countries. And boy, that is hard. Because you have rich countries like this one with loads of researchers, and even in somewhat penurious times, a lot of capacity. And then others where there's hardly any money, and the poor country is reeling from all kinds of pressures. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is that for the global study, even if a country like ours has great data, it can't be used. The data that are used have to be consistent everywhere. There are a lot of gaps, and we have to use modeling and so forth to fill them. The results are coarse compared to a national level study. And I should mention, we've only looked at and evaluated all of the exclusive economic zones. I think we've done 170. And we have not yet done the high seas. So that's coming this year. So here's how it works. You're basically worried about the present state compared to a reference state, and that gives what we call the current status. That's the top part. So you're looking at the current status, and you're looking also at what that status is likely to be in the near future, 5 years out. We call it the likely future status. To look at likely future status, we look at the trend, a 5-year trend. So this is not, we're not making something that predicts well into the future or looks way back in the past. It's 5 years either side of now, to the best of our ability. So we look at the trend, and we look at the pressures, and we look at the resilience factors, the actions, largely the actions that people have taken to try and reduce pressures for the future. And we weight the trends twice as heavily as the relationship between pressures and resilience. If pressures and resilience equal each other, they just cancel out, and that's fine. Trend has a reality. Trend is what you've been doing for the last 5 years. And generally speaking, you keep that up unless there's some really revolutionary changes in your behavior. So we weight the current status and the likely future state, F and F, and that produces the goal score. So the average of current status, likely future state, gives you the score for that goal. And then all of the goal scores are averaged to produce the index value for that country. And then all of those values are averaged in an area-weighted way to give the global score. So you know all of the pressures. I mean, there's nothing new here. The resilience factors are largely at the global level. Things like the percent of EEZs in marine protected areas, how well the country is managing its fisheries in a broad sense, whether the country has signed various treaties. There's a measure of ecological integrity I don't have to go into. And then there's what we were finding out is perhaps the most important thing, the quality of governance. And that's assessed by the World Governance Indicators done by the World Bank and others. And you'll see that that's key. So here's how one goal, which I thought would be interesting to this group, is calculated. This is for biodiversity. It has two sub-goals. One is species and one is habitats. For species, the We use the IUCN and the Global Marine Species Assessment Risk of Extinction classifications. And for habitats, we're looking at extent or condition of 6 habitats that are particularly important for biodiversity, but even more important, for which there are global data. There are other habitats, I'm sure, are important, we just don't have data for them. So, the reference point for status of species is that all species are at least concerned of extinction in the IUCN classification. It doesn't say they're perfect, and they may be declining slightly, but they're at least concerned. And for habitats, the reference point is that the extent or condition of mangroves or salt marshes or whatever is equal to what it was in about 1980. So, the idea of restoring the ocean to its pristine pre-human state is as desirable as it might seem, and I must say I was a fan of that at the beginning of this project. It's not possible, at least not for the foreseeable future, and it's bound to lead to frustration. So we've tried to use a reference point in all cases that is achievable, but is ambitious, and is measurable and time-bound, and so forth. So, to continue with this, the status, which for species is that all species are at least concerned, and the other is that the extent or condition of the habitats is what it was in 1980 about. And then we look at the trends for each, the pressures that are affecting each, and the resilience factors as we can get them. We take those, average them with the status to get the sub-goal score, and average the 2 sub-goal scores to get the integrated goal score. I don't think you can see this, and so all I'll say for these 2 slides is that the pressures are the same throughout the index. However, they're weighted differently for each of the goals and sub-goals and components. So that's pretty much stands to reason. For example, in corals, artisanal high bycatch fishing is highly ranked as a threat, but it is not for certain other things. So we don't have to worry about that stuff. It's bad. So for species, as I mentioned, every one of these things has a nice equation with it, so it's quantitative and you can see how everything works, and you don't have to worry about it now. All you have to worry about is that the sub-goal score for the world was 79. And that is a little alarming to some people. Some people think that's too high. I mean, we're reading about species going extinct every day and so forth. Well, there are pressures. There are not so many species going extinct every day. 79 is not a great score. If you came home from school with paper 79, I don't think your parents would be all that proud. It's not bad. It's better than you feared, but that's what it is. And when we looked at habitats, again with the model, that's just the step. That's just the status equation. It's a bigger equation, and we want even less. We evaluated coral reefs, mangrove forests, salt marshes, seagrass beds, subtidal soft bottom, of which there's quite a lot in the world, and sea ice. And I should mention, we did not, in this iteration, evaluate Antarctica at all. That is still to come. So it's Arctic sea ice. And the score here was 88, which was infuriating to some of the biodiversity folks because it, it just seemed that life was too good. And we know it's not. And but when analysis was done on these scores, it was quite revealing. If you graph the current state on the abscissa and the likely future state score on the orbit, I think that is, you see that a whole lot of dots fall below the line. Anything below the line is telling us that the likely score in the future is going to be worse than it is now. And as you can see from this thing, countries that have low scores are going to tend to have even lower scores in the future, and the few countries that have high scores over to the right of that line are going to have even better scores in the future. So they're doing something right. But on the whole, the people who contend that those scores are too high, they're right. Bad things are happening. So where do whales tie into all of this stuff? Or I should say marine mammals, because we're not just talking about whales. In the tourism and recreation goal, they are not explicitly included, but they're certainly implicit tourism generators. And they are working their magic there for sure. They are included as data layers for jobs and revenue in the coastal livelihoods and economies sector through the dollars and wages paid through whale watching. In the sense of place goal, they are included as some of the species in the iconic species sub-goal. And in the biodiversity goal, for sub-goal species, they are included because they're all evaluated by the IUCN, so their risk of extinction categories are included, and also their population trends, categorical as increasing, stable, decreasing, so forth, are included as trend for that. So those four goals include them. The global score for the 2012 Ocean Health Index was 60, which again, many people were surprised that it was that high. And I think one of the reasons is, of course, that everything we read in the paper is the bad story. This happened here and that oil spill happened there. There are success stories. There are places that are doing better. Some of the goals are doing okay. Some of the goals, I think, are low because of data limitations. But basically, that's what it was. And you can't really grade it. I hesitate to do that, but 60, we should be doing a lot better. And if you look at the distribution of scores around the world, first remember that this is only for exclusive economic zones, so we're only going out 200 miles. The high seas have not yet been evaluated. And basically, the red marks are all West Africa especially. And if you think about it, those are places where governance is just terrible. There's been warfare and tribal warfare and demagogues and every other thing. They're poor, and there just isn't time and money and attention for environment the way that there needs to be. And the only way that there will be is to get those countries out of the poverty cycle that they're in. And so I think what it suggested to us, and we were actually this one made us sit up. We saw the importance of governance in a broad sense, good governance with all that applies. a couple of flower petals of different places, the highest scoring island. And this is something I think is important for you. Because honestly, when we first came up with this model, some of my colleagues and friends who work on endangered species and work in a more protective kind of mode, they just hated it. They said, it looks as if it's completely utilitarian, and the object is to derive the maximal amount of benefit from each of those goals that can sustainably be gotten. The most fish that you can get sustainably, the most natural resources, natural products. It looks to us, they said, as if you're just mining the ocean. And well, what about protected areas? What about reserves? Will they score poorly because they're not harvested? And the answer is no. You can set aside as much as you wish as a protected area. You just don't score it for any of the extractive values. So that upper right petal diagram, if you can see it, is Jarvis Island. It's way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It is uninhabited. And so all of the extractive values are not counted in the score, and it was the top scoring area. So I think that was actually kind of reassuring to them that protected places can score highly, and I think that's good. We've had quite a lot of feedback about the Ocean Health Index. Lots of people just say, we love it, the website's beautiful. But some people say our score is too low. I didn't expect, well, no, I did expect to hear that. In the case of Columbia, they were very alarmed that the score was too low, and why didn't you tell us before, and we could have got ready for this. So, and you know what happened, though? Sebastian Train, who's the Vice President at Conservation International, and by the way, I work at Conservation International. The Ocean Health Index is not a Conservation International project. We're part of it, but it's a broad partnership. And anyway, he was down there talking with the Seascape team, and the president called him and he was very upset. And they called a meeting, and after the meeting with a number of the staff people and Sebastian, the president said, "You're right, this is important. We're going to include Blue Agenda in our future development." So that worked out pretty well. We've also had comments that the score is too high. That surprised me. I did a radio interview with folks in Antigua and Barbuda, and they said, "Geez, you really got it down here because it's way too high. We've got whale here everywhere and blah, blah, blah. And you're just not seeing that." And the answer is, they're right. It's too coarse-grained data. And so that stuff is invisible at this scale. So the EEZ boundaries need correction. Cyprus was absolutely livid. The ambassador called up and said, "Look at this EEZ. UK as part of our EEZ." And in fact, they did. It was wrong. There's an error there. And so that is, it was corrected in the next version of the EEZ boundaries, but we used an older version. We had to lump a couple of places together, and some of them because they didn't have enough data, so that has to get done. There's been some controversy about the wild-caught fishery scores. Ray Hilborn and Trevor Branch and our fisheries team will have an exchange of letters in Nature in the very near future. I know they didn't accept it. I mentioned the biodiversity scores, which the reason that they're higher than you'd expect is that the reference point is 1980. And yes, things have changed badly since 1980 for most of those habitats, in most, not all places. Had it been a historical reference point, pre-human or something like that, then it would have been terrible. Now it's just not so good and trending worse. The tourism scores are low for data reasons, and all of this stuff is being addressed with new publications, so you'll be able to follow along. What we still need, as you've all pointed out today, is a global layer for ocean noise. I think we need global layers for contaminants that are based on real data, what's in animal tissues and so forth. Right now it's modeled data. I think Frances Scullen has volunteered, she's started a committee. It's going to be, we're going to find out, see if we can make a layer on marine diseases, something like that, that could be included, or emerging diseases or epidemics or something. So we'll see. So improved global data layers are certainly needed, and improved regional data layers are needed everywhere. So where are we going and what's next? The first thing, as I mentioned, this is scalable. The whole model is designed to be used at different scales. We are using it right now, doing some focal studies. A Brazil study for all 17 of the states has been finished and I think accepted for publication. There's a study of Fiji that is not yet finished. The California current has been evaluated and the manuscript is done, and we're reviewing that now. Ben Halpern and Katie Longo are chief authors of it, and quite a number of others. And it's to look at what happens to when you use this model in a data-rich place. There's few places have the advantages that the Calpern has of so many bright minds and so much invested resources and attention over the years. So looking at that, and another case study on a subportion of Puget Sound. And then all of the blue stars or other countries that we're working with. Colombia, Ecuador, China, Philippines, Indonesia, and all of the 10 Nairobi Convention countries in Africa are considering doing their own ocean health index with their own regional data and in conjunction with help from NC. So that's going to be exciting. And those things will not be comparable. You won't be able to look at your own regional score. Ecuador and Colombia can't be in competition on that because theirs will each be a little different. But they'll be able to use it for managing their own countries, at least as one tool in the kit. So I mentioned the website, definitely go look at it. Improving it over time is going to be important. Outreach to key countries, supporting country-level studies, completing and publishing all of those focal studies, and building support for incorporating this kind of a model into national and international planning. So there's been a lot of outreach to different countries and flyers produced in different languages, giving their results and showing where they are with respect to the other countries. And that's important. Now, Brandon, he got to talk about his favorite book on zebras. And so I thought I better include this, The Magic School Bus. That was a great favorite of mine. At that time, there was only one book. I gather there's a whole series now, and one on the ocean floor. And so it is my way of asking if the index is some kind of magic button for ocean health. And the answer is no. The global scores only suggest what needs to be done, but country-level scores are going to be necessary for really guiding national actions. And there only going to be one, as you say, one tool in the box. There are lots of other studies that are needed. So I think this has been just a hugely interesting project for me. I've learned so much. I think it'll be useful for society. There seems to be a good amount of traction. It's not perfect. You're going to have to help us kick the tires on this thing for several years. The new kinds of data layers that we need are going to be very, very important. And so I want to thank the major partners, Pacific Life Foundation, of course, National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, See Around Us, New England Aquarium, National Geographic, Conservation International, and lots of people who work on this from various universities, laboratories, and agencies. It's been quite a ride, and I think it's got a pretty good future, I'm hoping so. So thanks very much, and thanks for all the help you've had.